Today is May 16th, 2026, and in the last 72 hours, something happened in the Persian Gulf that almost nobody is framing correctly. Beijing quietly pulled its diplomatic weight back from Tehran. Within hours, U.S. Fifth Fleet posture in the Gulf shifted from defensive escort to forward deterrence. And every Iranian assumption built over the last 18 months, the assumption that China would absorb the diplomatic cost of Iranian escalation, that the Strait of Hormuz was a Chinese-protected choke point, that Tehran could push American patrols and Beijing would push back, collapsed in a single weekend. This is not a story about China abandoning a partner. That framing is wrong. That framing is lazy. What actually happened is this. China ran the math on the Strait of Hormuz, ran the math on Iranian reliability, ran the math on what a real US-Iran kinetic exchange would cost Chinese energy imports, and made the only rational decision a great power makes when its client state becomes a liability. It walked. And the moment Beijing walked, the Persian Gulf became something it has not been since 2019. It became American water again. Fully, operationally, without a counterweight. Let me show you what this actually means, because the headlines are still treating this as a diplomatic spat. It is not a diplomatic spat. It is a structural realignment of the most important maritime choke point on the planet, and Tehran is now sitting alone in a kill box it spent a decade building for itself. The Iranian assumption, and this is where every Iranian strategist got it wrong from the start, was that Chinese energy dependence on Gulf crude was a permanent strategic shield. Roughly half of all Chinese crude imports transit Hormuz. Iran's leadership convinced itself, and more dangerously convinced its own field commanders, that Beijing would never tolerate American military dominance in those waters because Chinese tankers would be the first casualty of any disruption. Tehran built its entire Hormuz doctrine on that assumption. The IRGC Navy's swarm tactics, the College Fars and Hormuz 2 anti-ship ballistic missile deployments along the Bandar Abbas coast, the fast attack craft basing at Keshem in Iraq, all of it was predicated on the idea that Iran could threaten Gulf shipping with relative impunity because China would absorb the diplomatic blowback. That assumption was always going to fail. And here is why mainstream framing keeps missing it. China does not protect partners. China protects supply chains. And the moment Iranian behavior became the variable threatening those supply chains, rather than American behavior, the calculus inverted. The real question was never whether Beijing would back Iran against the United States. The real question was always at what threshold of Iranian recklessness Beijing would conclude that Tehran was the destabilizing variable. We just crossed that threshold. Pull the lens back. Because to understand what happened this past weekend, you have to understand what Chinese tanker traffic actually looks like through Hormuz. We are talking roughly 11 million barrels per day of Chinese-bound crude transiting a 21-mile choke point. The shipping lane is 2 miles wide in each direction. Insurance premiums on Gulf hulls have been climbing steadily since the IRGC seizure incidents of 2023 and 2024. And in the last 60 days, Chinese state-owned shippers, COSCO, China Merchants, the major Sinopec-affiliated charterers, quietly began rerouting a meaningful percentage of their Gulf liftings to alternative loading windows that minimize Iranian territorial water exposure. That was the first signal. Nobody outside the energy intelligence community caught it. The second signal came when Beijing stopped, and I mean fully stopped, issuing the boilerplate statements supporting Iranian sovereignty over the Hormuz transit lanes. Watch the language coming out of the Chinese Foreign Ministry over the last 3 weeks. It is sterile. It is procedural. It is the diplomatic equivalent of a great power getting ready to wash its hands. And it gets more serious from here because Iran's strategic command apparently did not catch it either. They were still operating on the 2024 assumption set. They were still running tabletop exercises that assumed Chinese diplomatic cover. And then the third signal landed. The third signal was the cancellation. I will not pretend I can name every classified element of what happened, but the open source picture is clear enough. A scheduled Chinese naval port call to Bandar Abbas was quietly pulled. A planned joint exercise in the northern Gulf was downgraded to a token presence and then postponed indefinitely. And the senior Chinese military attaché, who had been the primary backchannel between PLA Navy and IRGC Navy leadership, rotated out of Tehran with no announced replacement. That is not a coincidence. That is a deliberate signal. China was telling Iran, in the most professional and deniable language available, that the partnership had a ceiling and Tehran had hit it. Now let me show you what the American side was doing while this happened, because this is the part the headlines completely missed. The U.S. Fifth Fleet, operating out of Manama, did not react to the Chinese withdrawal. The U.S. Fifth Fleet anticipated it. CENTCOM had been repositioning assets for weeks. The USS Dwight D. Eisenhower Carrier Strike Group's rotation, the forward deployment of additional Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, The increased P-8 Poseidon Maritime Patrol sortie rate out of Al Udeid, the surge in MQ-9 Reaper coverage over the northern Gulf, none of this was a response to anything Iran did this month. This was preparation for the moment China stepped back. And that preparation is the operational tell that American intelligence saw the Chinese pivot before the Iranians did. Think about what that means. The most consequential adversary in the Gulf, the regime that has spent 20 years building a doctrine around denying American freedom of navigation, was strategically surprised by its own primary backer's withdrawal. The Pentagon was not. That is not a small intelligence asymmetry. That is the kind of asymmetry that decides what happens in the next kinetic exchange before the first missile launches. And here is where the operational picture sharpens. The U.S. force package now sitting in and around the Persian Gulf is, in plain terms, overwhelming. The Eisenhower Strike Group brings Carrier Air Wing 3, which means roughly 44 FA-18EF Super Hornets across the strike fighter squadrons, E-2D Advanced Hawkeyes for airborne early warning, EA-18G Growlers for electronic attack, and the MH-60RS helicopter detachments handling anti-submarine warfare and surface threats. Ring that with the Berks, Aegis Combat System, SM-6 and SM-2 in the cells for air defense, Tomahawk Block 5 for land attack, and you have a layered defensive bubble that the IRGC simply cannot saturate with current inventory. Add what is forward-based. Al Udeid in Qatar, Al Dhafra in the UAE, where the F-35As of the 380th Air Expeditionary Wing have been quietly accumulating sortie hours over the Gulf for months. Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia, the B-1B Lancers that have been cycling through the theater, the B-52H presence at Diego Garcia within striking range, the KC-46 and KC-135 tanker fleet that makes all of it persistent. And then add what is in the water that you cannot see. Virginia-class fast attack submarines with Tomahawk Block 5 capability, operating in the Gulf of Oman and probably inside the Gulf itself, holding every Iranian coastal target at risk without ever surfacing. This is the force structure that China just decided was not worth contesting. Read that sentence again. Beijing looked at this exact American posture, ran the cost-benefit on backing Iran through a confrontation against it, and concluded the answer was no. That is the verdict. That is the strategic reality the headlines are not naming. Now, the real question is what Iran does with this discovery. Because Tehran has only 3 doors, and every one of them is worse than the last. Door 1 is capitulation, meaning a quiet diplomatic de-escalation, a return to nuclear talks on weaker terms, a tacit acceptance that Hormuz is American water. The regime cannot survive Door 1 politically. It has spent too many decades selling resistance to walk it back without internal collapse. Door 2 is asymmetric escalation, meaning Houthi proxy activity in the Bab el-Mandeb, Hezbollah pressure on Israel's northern front, Shia militia operations against U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria. That door is open, but it does not solve the Gulf problem. It just trades one front for 3. Door 3 is direct kinetic escalation in Hormuz itself, and that door, with China no longer underwriting the diplomatic cost, leads directly into the kill box. Let me show you what the kill box looks like. Because this is the part of the analysis that mainstream coverage simply does not have the technical vocabulary to deliver. Iran's coastal anti-ship capability, the Noor and Qadr anti-ship cruise missiles, the Khalij Fars and Hormuz 2 anti-ship ballistic missiles, the fast attack craft swarms operating out of Bandar Abbas, Bandar Lenga, and the greater Tumb Island, is real. It is not nothing. In a fully saturated salvo against an unprepared convoy, it could absolutely cause damage. But it is not designed to fight a prepared, layered, electronically dominant American strike group with full ISR coverage and the ability to strike first. Here is what an exchange looks like operationally. The moment Iran commits to a coastal anti-ship salvo, the launch signatures are detected by space-based infrared, by RC-135 rivet joint signals intelligence aircraft orbiting the theater, by the P-8s on patrol, and by the Aegis radars on the destroyers. Aegis cues the SM-6 interceptors. The Growlers begin electronic attack on Iranian fire control radars and command and control nodes. The Super Hornets and F-35s, already airborne in combat air patrol, vector to launch points. And within minutes, the Tomahawks from the submarines and surface combatants are inbound on the Iranian coastal missile sites, the radar installations at Bandar Abbas, the IRGC Navy command nodes on Keshem. The fast boats, the Paykop, the Tyr, the various IRGC Navy speedboat variants, never get to close distance. They get hit by Apache AH-64Es operating from forward arming points, by Reaper-launched Hellfire and now Hellfire replacement JAGM, by the destroyer's own 5-inch guns and CRAM systems. The swarm doctrine the IRGC has rehearsed for 20 years requires permissive ISR conditions and an unprepared adversary. Neither exists right now. And here is the hidden operational variable that nobody is talking about. The American posture in the Gulf right now is not a deterrent posture. It is a first strike ready posture. Those are different things. A deterrent posture says, if you attack us, we will respond. A first strike ready posture says, if you so much as begin the kinematic preparation for an attack, we already have the targeting solution, and we will close the loop before your missile leaves the rail. That is what the surge in ISR coverage, the persistent F-35 presence, and the forward submarine deployment actually mean. The Pentagon is not waiting to be hit. The Pentagon is watching every Iranian launch site in real time, and the moment a missile transporter erector launcher moves into a firing position, that vehicle becomes a target. Pull the lens back again, because I want you to see the pattern this confirms. For the last decade, the conventional wisdom in Washington was that Iran had built an asymmetric denial capability sufficient to make a US-Iran Gulf War prohibitively expensive. That conventional wisdom was always overstated. The mines, the boats, the coastal missiles, they were always a deterrent against a casual American intervention, not against a fully committed American campaign. And once China stepped back, the cost calculus for a fully committed American campaign dropped dramatically, because the post-strike diplomatic ceiling is no longer constrained by Chinese pressure. This is the larger pattern. The Iranian strategic position was always a confidence game. It depended on adversaries believing the cost of confrontation was higher than it actually was. China believed it long enough to be useful. China stopped believing it 3 weeks ago. The Pentagon stopped believing it years ago. And the only player left at the table who still believes it is the regime in Tehran itself. Now let me get to the part the headlines completely missed, because everyone is reading this as a China story, and it is not really a China story. It is a Russia story. Watch what Moscow does in the next 2 weeks, because Russia is the only remaining great power patron Iran has, and Russia is currently absorbing every spare ruble of military and diplomatic capacity into Ukraine and the broader European confrontation. Russia cannot underwrite an Iranian Gulf adventure right now. Russia does not have the bandwidth, and the Kremlin knows this, which means the next Russian diplomatic signal toward Tehran is going to look very similar to the Chinese one: sterile, procedural, and quietly distancing. When that happens, and it will happen, Iran will be fully isolated for the first time since the early 2000s. No Chinese diplomatic cover, no Russian arms pipeline at scale, no proxy network capable of generating strategic, as opposed to tactical pressure, and a U.S. force posture in the Gulf that is operationally configured for first strike engagement. That is the structural reality the headlines are not naming. That is the hidden operational turn. And it gets more serious from here, because the regime, sensing isolation, has historically chosen escalation. That is the pattern. 1988, 2011, 2019, 2024. Every time Tehran has sensed strategic encirclement, the response has been a calibrated provocation designed to test whether the encirclement is real. That provocation is coming. The question is not whether, the question is where, and how the United States responds. The most likely vectors of these: a Houthi anti-ship missile or drone attack on a Gulf transiting tanker, deniable but clearly Iranian supplied; a Shia militia rocket or drone strike on a U.S. base in Iraq or Syria; a cyber operation against Gulf energy infrastructure; or, the highest risk option, an IRGC Navy interdiction of a commercial vessel inside the strait. Each of these is a test. Each is calibrated to be just under the threshold the regime believes will trigger an overwhelming American response. The problem for Tehran is that the threshold has moved, and the regime does not know where it now sits. That is the asymmetric information problem that defines the next phase of this confrontation. The Americans know where the threshold is. The Iranians are guessing. And in any confrontation where one side knows the rules and the other side is guessing, the guessing side loses the first exchange and is forced to recalibrate under fire. That is the operational position Iran is now in. It is the position China just walked away from underwriting. It is the position the regime in Tehran has not yet publicly acknowledged, because acknowledging it would be a confession of strategic failure. Here is the verdict. The Persian Gulf, as of this week, is American water. Not contested water, not deterred water, American water. The combination of Chinese disengagement, Russian distraction, the forward deployed U.S. force package, and the intelligence asymmetry between the Pentagon and the IRGC creates a window of American operational dominance that has not existed in the Gulf since the immediate aftermath of Operation Praying Mantis in 1988. That window will not stay open forever, but it is open now. And the question is what Washington does with it. The honest assessment is that the Pentagon is unlikely to initiate. American doctrine in this theater is reactive by design. But reactive does not mean weak. Reactive means that the moment Iran tests the new threshold, and the regime will test it, probably within the next 2 to 6 weeks, the American response will be disproportionate to the provocation by design, calibrated to demonstrate to Tehran exactly how far the strategic balance has moved. That demonstration is what closes out the post-2019 deterrence cycle and opens whatever comes next. What comes next is probably not war in the maximalist sense. What comes next is a series of compressed kinetic exchanges in which the United States establishes new rules of engagement in the Gulf by punishing Iranian probes with a force ratio the regime cannot match. That is what dominance looks like in the modern era. It is not invasion. It is the imposition of cost asymmetry until the adversary's behavior changes. And the larger pattern this confirms is the one that matters most for understanding the next decade. Great power patronage is no longer reliable for revisionist middle powers. China demonstrated that this month. Russia is demonstrating it in slower motion. The actors that built their entire strategic identity around the assumption that a great power umbrella would protect them from American military dominance are discovering that the umbrella was always conditional, and the conditions just changed. Iran is the first test case. It will not be the last. Watch what happens to the calculations of every other middle power regime that has been operating under the assumption of Chinese or Russian backing, because they are all watching this play out and they are all running the same revised math right now. Here is where the situation stands. The Strait of Hormuz is operationally American. China has withdrawn the diplomatic cover Tehran was counting on. Russia cannot replace it. The Iranian leadership has 3 doors, and every one of them is worse than the last. The Pentagon has positioned for first strike-ready engagement, not deterrence. And the next Iranian provocation, when it comes, will trigger a response calibrated to make the new balance unmistakable. Subscribe and turn on notifications because the next 48 hours may matter more than the last 2 weeks. Drop your prediction in the comments. Stay informed, stay ahead.